Welcome to English Wine Tasting Tours. My name is Justin, and I'm going to tell you about the history of English wine. English wine started about 2,000 years ago when the Romans invaded in 43 AD. With them, they brought knowledge of viticulture and established vineyards in the UK at this time. Now, in Roman society, everyone had a role and a responsibility to play. If you knew how to make bricks, you would lay roads, build castle walls. And if you knew how to grow grapes, well, you'd make wine. And that was your job in society. Now, vastly, the Romans, most of the wine they drank was imported. They'd either bring it from Italy all the way around to Portugal and into Brittany that way, or they would actually just sail it across the channel from France. Now, all this came to an end around 400 AD when the Romans left. And then for the next 600 years, the Anglo-Saxons came into power. The Anglo-Saxons were a warring tribal group of people. They really didn't have much thirst for wine or viticulture, more for blood and raping and pillaging of villages. They had a bigger desire for mead and beer, so wine wasn't really a thing for the next 600 years after the Romans left. Now that changed on a fateful day in October in 1066. It was October 14th, and we know it as the Battle of Hastings. And this is where William the Conqueror had sailed across the English Channel, and he was going to claim England for his own. Now, the relevance of this is very important. On that day, the last Anglo-Saxon king fell, and with him, also the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule. William went to London, he crowned himself king, and what he also did was very important. He had the Domesday Book commissioned. Now, the Domesday Book was really relevant for the mere fact that it took 20 years to write, but it accounted for all the king's assets. But in there, it noted that there were 46 vineyards on account in the king's assets. Well, 12 of those were associated to monasteries, and the rest were on noble houses. Well, we have a clear point in time now, 950 years ago, what actually happened, and that we had a collection of vineyards here. Albeit small, most of the wine we still drank back then was imported into the country. The next 200 to 300 years, viticulture flourishes, does fairly well here in the UK. Monasteries are taking off, and Christianity is driving this push. Most of the vineyards that would have been established here during this time were on monasteries. The monks mainly came from Bordeaux, and they also came from Tours or Loire Valley, and they came up here to work on the monasteries, and they brought their knowledge of wine and viticulture with them. Things were going fairly well till about the middle of the 14th century, and we had a problem. It was called the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague wiped out about 1 in 3 and affected mainly peasant and slave labor most of all. Well, those were the people that you needed to actually do the harvest. And without them, most of the vineyards went into decay. There was no point in harvesting because you didn't have any help. If we put this into context and we think about arable ground, 2,000-3,000 acres, a couple of men, combine harvester, tractor, and trailer, they can do the whole thing on their own. But to harvest a vineyard, to harvest grapes, you need at least 17 people to do 10 acres over a week and a half time. So it's a lot more manual intensive. And back then, during the 14th century, when you lost most of your help, you had a problem. Wine didn't do very well here in the UK, or in the sense of viticulture. For the next 200 to 300 years, it was quite poor. We get into the 15th, the 16th century. We had King Henry VIII come into power. And with that, by 1509, he was into power. By 1537, he dissolved the monasteries. Well, the monasteries were actually, those were the monks. They knew how to make wine. And if they weren't making any wine, then that's about it for English viticulture. They were out of a job. Well, the next thing you know, things aren't going very well for English wine. We get into the 17th century. There's a bit of a revolution, if you will. What we had occur here was a technology invention that really sparred the promotion of the process for sparkling wine as we know it today. Most people think the French invented sparkling wine. That's not true at all. It was an Englishman. His name was Christopher Merritt. He wrote into the Royal Horticulture Society saying that he has developed a way to make fizzy wine. Did it with apples too. So he's making cider and champagne as we know it today. One of the things that enabled him to do this was the ability to get his hands on stronger technology for glass-making capabilities. He was able to find stronger glass to hold all that pressure in. When we think about doing the traditional method, that second fermentation in the bottle, there's quite a bit of pressure in there. Some reckon up to 2 to 3 bar pressure. So, the 17th century, while we developed the idea and the ability to make sparkling wine, still not a lot of wine was made in England. We still imported the vast percentage of everything we drank. We get into the 18th century. We had Queen Anne to reign for the first 15 years of that, and then George the First, second, and third. Now, the Georgians, they had a thirst for port. They liked to drink it with their meal, their main meal. And they didn't drink it at the end of a meal with a little bit of cheese and a small glass. It was actually a goblet they would drink it with. And they'd sit there with a leg of lamb and all the trimmings and go through a bit of 20% tawny. And if you want to live merry like a Georgian, I suggest you try to do the same. But that's how the Georgians lived. Of course, they had a real problem with gout, and we all know that. But anyhow, they had a good time while they did it. We get into the 19th century, we have the Victorians into power. I always love it whenever I see a great Victorian garden. You know, I'm at a manor house and I'm looking at the garden. I'm like, oh, what am I supposed to be looking for? And I'm looking in there and I see that there's, some exotic plants, some Japanese lilies, a banana tree. You're like, nothing in there is English. Victorians had a thirst for exotic plants. And they thought it was going to be a great idea to actually import these lovely American grapevines. And little did they know, those grapevines harvested a bug called phylloxera. Now, briefly on phylloxera, how it works, it's a pesky little thing, but it burrows into the rootstock. It does it on the American vines and it does it onto the European canes. Now, Kew Gardens is where these came in originally into England, and they got distributed out through the rest of the mainland continent. Now, the French farmers, they couldn't figure out what was going on. Some people reckon that they used to bury live frogs next to the vines, thinking that might have some sort of relevance or help to solving the problem. But it took a little bit for people to understand what was happening. But this little bug burrows into the rootstock on both vines. But the big difference is American rootstocks got thicker sap. It heals the wound. Bacteria can't enter. Not so on the European vines. So the French realized that they took their noble canes off their European rootstock and grafted it onto the American rootstock. As the French say, voila, they solved the problem. Sure enough, whenever I look at a vineyard and I see a little knuckle of grafting about 4 inches off the ground out there in the field, I see the trunk, and down below is that grafting knuckle. I always think of Kew Gardens and their thirst for exotic plants, not phylloxera. Get into the 20th century. We have 2 world wars to fight at the beginning of that. Viticulture in the UK still wasn't really on anybody's radar. Back then, because we had wars to fight, if you had a vineyard, you would have grubbed it up, probably planted things to feed the armies, potatoes, parsnips, carrots, those kind of things. You would have helped with the war effort, and that would have been the noble thing to do. But all this changed. Viticulture, as we know it in the UK in the modern age, really happened in the 1950s, late 40s, 50s. There was an old army veteran out in Hampshire, and he'd been stationed down in parts of France and Germany during the war. When he got back, he thought, you know what, I'm going to try to grow some grapes here. I'll give it a go. And he was out in Hambledon in Hampshire, so he got him some Ortega. He planted it on the hillside. Sure enough, he got a harvest. He made wine. He bottled it. He labeled it. And it looked like for the first time in 1952, English wine was for sale commercially. Well, they started a revolution. Everyone started to look about what this guy was doing out in Hampshire. Everyone started to look at what this man was doing out in Hampshire, and they were like amazed. A lot of the orchard growers, fruit farmers, subsidies were drying up from the central government. We joined the single market in 1973, so things weren't looking very good. We had a lot of apples coming across from Normandy, so people thought they were going to try to turn their hand at growing grapes. Sure enough, you see some of the older vineyards like Beddington Vineyard, 1968. Even Spott's Farm, where Chapel Down is today, was 1977. That means Stephen Skelton was over in the early to mid part of the 70s in Germany learning about viticulture. He came back home and planted on the family farm. You've also got Carr Taylor, David and Linda Carr Taylor, outside of Westfield near Hastings. In Settlescombe, that was planted by Roy and Irma Cook in 1977. So these are some of the initial founders of the revolution of viticulture throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But what they grew were grapes that a lot of people aren't so familiar with. They grew Germanic grapes, grapes that do well in a cool climate. Things that you probably haven't heard before. If I were to say Herxeriba or Schonberger or Richtensteiner or Ortega or Bacchus, Donfelder, Regent, Rondo, most people haven't heard of those grape varieties. I've done a lot of tours in my time, and most people don't know any of those. And it's good to try them. I recommend everyone explore to try some of those Germanic varieties because that's where we started. And we still have a lot of vineyards that grow those grape varieties, and some are even going back to them. But let me explain a little bit more where they went. What happened is everyone was quite happy growing their Germanic grape varieties throughout those periods and those decades. We get into the 1990s, though. We have two things that happen. We have this vineyard over in West Sussex called Nye Timber, and they quietly got rid of their Germanic grape varieties. They had them just like everyone else. They planted the three noble grapes that go into a sparkling wine or a champagne. They planted Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. Well, they got a harvest. They went ahead and made wine, and then they went through a second fermentation and made sparkling wine. Merged within about 3 years' time, by the early mid-1990s, they come out and say, look at what we did. We made sparkling wine or champagne in England. Well, this turned some heads. Everyone was really interested in this. They thought, bloody hell, they've done it. I want to get into that game. I want to get out of my German varieties, and I want to make fizz. Who doesn't want to? Well, one of the things that enabled Nye Timber to go through this process to grow the noble grape varieties was a key factor was global warming. Our climate warmed in the 1990s by 1 degree, significant enough to make ripening of that fruit, or grapes. Effectively, our temperature became the same temperature as it was in Champagne in the 80s. Champagne's actually a degree warmer, and they struggle with a lot of fungus, botrytis, downy mildew, those kind of things. They spray quite intensively. It gets too warm there in the August and September months. Our climate is now perfect for growing sparkling wine. We call this, with Nye Timber, the Nye Timber effect, and that's what it's known as. And it started a chain reaction and another catalyst, and it's probably the number one reason why 70% of everything we produce is sparkling wine in this country. And it's due to global warming and us trying to grow those grapes and the Nye Timber effect. We get into the 21st century. We now that we can make sparkling wine, we attract a different type of person into the industry. People that made their money in London. There used to be all these fruit farmers that have kind of come good on it, but now that you can make fizz, it attracts a whole nother type of individual that wants to get into this game. You have people like Mark Driver. He owns Raffini Estate down on the South Downs. You also have Richard Balfour Lynn. He owns Hush Heath Estate, 400-acre estate. Mark Dixon, he owns Regis Office Space. He owns Settlescombe Organic, Kingscote, and a farm on the North Downs. So these people wanted to get into the industry kind of in the early part of the 21st century. And what they did is a couple of good things too. So we still had our fruit farmers, but what we now had was this additional money and capital for a few other things. We increased our production. We increased our plantings. You know, we do about maybe, I always say, figure 10 million bottles a year. Now we're trying to get up to 15. There's been some great plantings in the last 2 to 3 years, and that's all coming online now. It depends on the year, right? You can never predict tonnage and yield, but I say 10 to 15 million bottles is probably what we would estimate to produce this year. Or a small industry, a micro industry. And to put it in perspective, there are 14 wine regions in France. Champagne alone does, 350 million, 400 million bottles of wine. So we're just a tiny little pinprick on the worldwide, global scale of wine. So whenever I ask people, do you know that, we have 500 vineyards and 165 wineries here? Everyone's like, no, I didn't know that. We don't have very good awareness. That's our probably number one big challenge that we have as an industry, to change that, to make it better, to increase people's awareness that we have a thriving industry that creates a premium product. I think what we've seen in the last 10 years is further investment in facilities and tasting rooms. Taking that notion of kind of a fruit farmer with, I used to go to some vineyards and they just roll up their barn roller door and you just do a tasting there. It's quite informal. It's fun in a way. But the truth of the matter is people have invested in their vineyards and they've invested in their facilities to where we now have a more appropriate wine tasting and wine tourism capability. I always say, most of our awareness for English wine was through international exposure. And that's been very helpful because we look to distribute nearly 25% of everything we produce by 2025. I think what we'll see is continued growth and development, further plannings. I think we'll see more smaller producers get into the game into the future. I think we're seeing even the bigger producers look at small batch runs, looking how to diversify into the market, not necessarily going for the mainstream supermarket volume, but more higher end, better quality wine. And I think we can do it. Our weather and climate are enabling us to produce the better quality of wine. And with the visionaries that we have leading the industry, I think we will achieve it. And it is coming. And thank you for everyone coming on an English wine tour today. I look forward to seeing you. And if you have any questions, please do ask your tour guide. Thank you. Bye bye.